So let's start off with malting. And this is mostly done by the suppliers. The brewing factory does not necessarily do this step. So majority brewers get this in as a raw material. Malting, essentially the grains of your choosing. So whether that's barley is the most common, by the way. Barley is soaked in water to initiate germination. Germination can take up to 6 days, depending on the factory capabilities, and then kind of the type of grain they choose. Essentially, the enzymes break down the starches into simple sugars. And then the barley or the oat or whatever the grain is then dried in a kiln. Then that's essentially malted barley, malted oats, or malted whatever the grain is. Then comes mashing, which is essentially the first step in most of the breweries. The malted barley or malted grain or whatever is mixed in with hot water. Essentially, that triggers the conversion of the starches in the grains into sugars, which that sugary extract is called a wort, W-O-R-T.
So you mentioned the germination at the beginning. So that germination process, is it literally happening from soaking the grain in water, or is there any other ingredient that is added to kind of start that separation of starches and the sugars like you mentioned?
No. So it's essentially just soaked in water. And that
Just soaked in
triggers
water.
the germination process. Yeah. And then mashing kind of takes it a little further, right? Mashing has one goal. Mashing's goal is to maximize sugar yield. More sugar, better, because the more sugar you have, the more alcohol you can get. The next step is lautering. Essentially, what it means, that wort, that sugary liquid syrup we're talking about, you need to separate the grains from it. So in a tank with a small opening at the bottom, this kind of liquid mixture is recirculated. And eventually at the bottom, there's a naturally occurring filter bed from the grains that is occurring. And so after recirculation, you finally get the separated wort or that sugary liquid that is now ready for the boiling stage. In the boiling stage, so the sugary liquid is added into a big industrial kettle, boiling kettle with water. Hops is also added, so that's the flour we were talking about. And then flavorings is added at this stage as well. And it boils. And after the boiling stage, they let it cool off in a chiller, because then the next step after that is fermentation. This is essentially where the magic happens. I mean, these places have a farm of tanks. It was just not one, two, three. There's a farm. And yeast is added. And at this stage, they also could add fruit extracts. They could also add spices, herbs at this stage as well. And then this fermentation process essentially has the sugars converted into alcohol and carbon dioxide.
And the longer they ferment, the higher the alcoholic content of that beer, correct?
Yeah, there's like what, lagers, there's
The
ales,
IPAs
there's
and a lot of
yeah,
other variations and goes up between like 5 to 12, 14%, I think. So there's a
correct.
huge range. So the longer the fermentation process, the more alcohol. What's
Correct.
the average fermentation duration for each of the types?
So depending on the type of beer, so ales is 3 to 7 days fermentation process, lagers are 2 to 3 weeks fermentation process, and stouts are 2 to 4 weeks fermentation process. It depends on what product you're trying to make, and the fermentation differs, and also certain recipes from a manufacturer is also kind of dependent on how they're going to formulate.
Okay, so you have your fermentation done. That means and you've mentioned the flavors, you mentioned the hops and all of that. What happens next? That to me, it seems like you're getting very close to getting your beer. Is there anything else that they need to do to have a finished beer product?
So until now, it was almost a mimic of the beer process. For non-alcoholic beer, you now have to concentrate on alcohol removal. Alcohol removal is done by three major methods, or three main methods: thermal processing, membrane filtration, and arrested fermentation. So thermal processing, essentially, there's two main methods under that: is vacuum distillation and dealcoholization. So vacuum distillation is the beer is heated under a vacuum and the alcohol is evaporated at 35 degrees Celsius and it is separated out. There is no effect on the quality and taste and flavor. The second method is dealcoholization, which is flash pasteurization. Rapid application of temperature, so 78 degrees Celsius, the alcohol is heated and removed. It may have an impact on flavor and taste. So it comes
Potentially
with its
burn
own
it.
it comes
Yeah,
with its own risk. Yeah.
that's something we mentioned in milk as ultra pasteurization,
We did, yes.
and one of the risks of ultra pasteurization is because you're reaching a very high temperature. If you do it for too long, you could burn the product and start to have like a bitterness or impact the flavor.
Right.
So to me, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, and then so the second method is membrane filtration. So reverse osmosis. We mentioned it in our smart
Really?
water, bottled water episode. Same thing, right? The beer is passed through a semi-permeable membrane, and water and alcohol pass through the membrane. The flavors, herbs, spices, all that compounds remain, and so water, alcohol out, separated.
So hold on. When you use reverse osmosis, you're essentially taking out a lot of the good stuff that a beer has, not just the alcohol. So do they reverse add all these ingredients when they use reverse osmosis, or are they special filtration systems that they have that allows them to pick what kind of like only the alcohol out?
So a little bit of both. Their semi-permeable membrane has a certain size, and whatever molecules are smaller than that size will pass through. In this specific case, water and alcohol would pass through, everything else would stay. And you're probably thinking, okay, the water is the main ingredient. If it passes through, what do you have remaining? Good question. Then they control add the water back, and they can control
I see.
levels. They can get a syrup, they can get a paste, they can get something thin liquid, they can get some watery liquid, whatever they want. They're able to then control add it back.
So that essentially means they would just allows them to create different flavors almost by adding different levels of water, right?
Yeah, they
Back to
have
those
a lot.
flavor
Yeah,
concentration that they now
they
have.
have a lot more control. They have a lot more control.
Okay. And what
Then
about the last one you mentioned, arrested fermentation?
the third method is arrested fermentation. What they do is they add special yeasts or special microorganisms that ferment but produce little to no alcohol as a almost like a byproduct. They produce like acids, like lactic acids instead. And or if they produce and they ferment, they just ferment little, like very low amounts in fermentation.
That to me makes the most sense. If you're able to do that, then you can just produce the alcoholic beer and be done with it instead of going through all those filtration processes. Which one does O'Doul uses or Anheuser-Busch uses?
O'Doul's uses vacuum distillation. So they heat the beer under a vacuum and then remove the alcohol that way. Low pressure, low temperature, no effect on flavor.
So it sounds like we have our beer now. Are we ready to package, or I guess do they need to pasteurize it, or is it already gone through pasteurization for non-alcoholic since you had to heat it?
No, so two steps now. First is carbonation, then it's pasteurization. So carbonation we mentioned before in our energy drink episode. Same kind of process. Either the liquid goes in a tank and carbon dioxide is injected into it, or it goes through piping and carbon dioxide is injected as it's flowing through the inline pipes. And then after that, it goes into pasteurization where the liquid is heated to 70 degrees Celsius, 15 to 30 minutes. Once that's done, it's ready to go into packaging.